Maybe North Korea is about to attack Ukraine directly. Zelensky has actually stated that Russia would like to deploy another 30,000 North Korean soldiers against his country. And the Kremlin has neither confirmed nor denied this account. Its spokesperson simply stated that it is not up to Zelensky to talk about Russian plans. The fact is that the situation is worrying. Because if it is true that thousands of North Korean soldiers have already fought against the Ukrainians in the Russian region of Kursk, it is also true that their possible entry into Ukraine would represent a serious escalation. Because for the first time, Pyongyang's troops would directly participate in the invasion of Ukrainian territory. I've noticed that many of you watch my videos and I'm really happy about it, but you're not subscribed, so if you enjoy my content, please subscribe. It's free for you, but it's really vital for the project. Thank you very much. Ukraine and North Korea are thousands of kilometers apart, and for many years their relationship remained marginal. However, distance has gradually lost its importance as Pyongyang began to support Russia's territorial claims, aligning its foreign policy with Putin's strategy against Ukraine. And the first sign dates back to 2014 when North Korea expressed support for Russia's annexation of Crimea. And this alignment then became much more evident after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. When North Korea recognized the self-proclaimed People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk as independent states, formed in Ukrainian territory and controlled since 2014 by pro-Russian separatists. Thus, North Korea became the third country to do so after Russia and Syria, and before they were then illegally annexed to Russia. This decision for Kyiv represented support for the strategy used by Moscow to justify the invasion of the country. And in fact, Ukraine immediately broke off diplomatic relations with Pyongyang. Moreover, in the following months, North Korea also supported the Russian annexations of the occupied territories. So, completely siding with Putin and against Ukraine. And for Moscow, this support was primarily political, because it allowed the Kremlin to show that its war was not completely without support. For Kim Jong-un, on the other hand, siding with Russia meant strengthening the relationship with a nuclear power, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, and it too was also facing growing isolation from the West. The political convergence thus created the conditions for a much more serious collaboration, and when the war turned into a war of attrition, North Korea realized it could offer Russia something Moscow needed. In fact, the war in Ukraine consumes enormous quantities of artillery shells every day. Both sides must strike the positions to support their infantry operations, and North Korea had stockpiled a lot of ammunition for decades in anticipation of a possible conflict against South Korea on the Korean peninsula. And keep in mind, part of these stockpiles was compatible with the Russian army's systems. And here, according to a report I consulted to make this video. Between September 2023 and March 2025, Russian ships reportedly made 64 trips from North Korea to Russia. With the analysis of satellite images, it was estimated that almost 16,000 containers were transported. Now clearly, we can't verify the contents of every single container, but based on the available images and the spread of North Korean ammunition on the front lines, it is estimated that between 4 and 6 million artillery shells were transported to Russia during that period. But be careful, there are also other estimates that go up to 9 million North Korean rounds for Russian artillery just in 2024. So the figures are not perfectly comparable, also because they come from different calculation methods. However, there is agreement on the scale of the phenomenon and on the fact that these were not just a few symbolic shipments, but an organized and continuous military supply. So much so that Ukrainian intelligence claimed that North Korea supplied about half of the ammunition used by Russia on the front line, while a Ukrainian military expert consulted by Reuters indicated a share that could reach up to 70%, but unfortunately, the cooperation did not stop with artillery shells. In fact, according to the report I mentioned earlier, North Korea allegedly transferred to Russia also at least 100 ballistic missiles in 2024. Meanwhile, Ukrainian intelligence estimated that by early 2025, Pyongyang would have supplied 148 missiles to Moscow. Now clearly, we don't have a publicly available inventory from Russia and North Korea. However, the use of North Korean missiles against Ukraine has been documented. So the numbers are probably not 100% accurate, but the phenomenon is real. And one of the most serious incidents happened right in Kyiv in April 2025. When a North Korean-made missile hit a residential building causing 12 casualties, and this, pay attention, should worry not only Ukraine but also South Korea. The initial North Korean missiles Russia used against Ukraine were actually not very accurate. And according to Kyiv, in the first weeks, only 2 out of 24 attacks hit military targets. However, 2 Ukrainian sources later told Reuters that the more recent versions have become more accurate, and they could land within 50 to 100 meters of the target. The Ukrainian front is therefore giving Pyongyang the opportunity to verify how its missiles work, and to improve their quality. That's why Seoul needs to monitor the situation. But unfortunately, this was only the beginning. In fact, the relationship between Russia and North Korea took another leap in June 2024 when Putin and Kim Jong-un signed a strategic partnership treaty. And according to the text released by North Korean state media, if either of the two countries were invaded and found themselves in a state of war, the other would have to provide military assistance by all means at its disposal. However, it should also be noted that the agreement states that any intervention must comply with national laws, and Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, which relates to the right of self-defense. While Kim described the treaty as the birth of an alliance, Putin used a more cautious wording. Yet analysts were divided on the scope of the clause because some interpreted it as the restoration of alliances that existed during the Cold War. But others pointed out that the reference to national laws and to the United Nations Charter could limit the obligation to intervene. In any case, the treaty offers both governments a framework to justify military cooperation. And when Ukrainian forces entered the Russian region of Kursk in August 2024, Moscow could present the operation as an attack against its own territory and use the mutual assistance clause to legitimize the arrival of North Korean units, and according to Ukrainian officials, North Korea sent a total of about 14,000 soldiers at the time, including 3,000 reinforcements meant to replace the losses suffered by the first contingents. Meanwhile, the South Korean intelligence service later estimated a deployment of about 15,000 troops. In any case, the North Korean soldiers were trained and equipped in Russia before being sent to fight against the Ukrainians in the Kursk region, and as you would expect, at first they faced great difficulties on the battlefield because the North Koreans had no experience with drones and did not have adequate equipment. Also, keep in mind, a Ukrainian commander who had fought against them said that the North Korean units were mainly used in assaults, while the Russian troops advanced afterward to consolidate the captured positions. Nevertheless, the North Korean reinforcements that arrived later turned out to be better prepared than the first contingents, and this help allowed Russia to deploy additional forces and launch new operations to retake the region and the North Korean troops together with the ammunition supplied by Pyongyang. They greatly helped Moscow increase pressure on Ukrainian units despite heavy North Korean losses. For example, a South Korean source estimated that by January 2025, about 4,000 North Korean soldiers would have been killed or wounded. But there were also some prisoners though. In January 2025, in fact, Zelensky announced the capture of 2 North Korean soldiers, and the two said they had arrived in Russia in November 2024. They participated in training camp exercises and later received Russian military documents without photos. And among other things, it seems that at first they were told they were going to Russia for training, but instead they went to the battlefield and were captured. For over 6 months, Moscow and Pyongyang did not publicly acknowledge North Koreans' presence, but this changed in April 2025. When both governments admitted the deployment, and they claimed that the soldiers had helped push back Ukrainian forces from the Kursk region, with Putin thanking Kim and calling the North Koreans who died for Russia heroes. And the following year, Pyongyang even opened a museum dedicated to the fallen soldiers, and Kim Jong-un and important Russian officials attended the ceremony, while Putin sent a letter in which he described the memorial as a symbol of the relationship between the two countries. And now, a new chapter could begin. The possible arrival of another 30,000 soldiers would in fact be a significant increase compared to the contingents already sent. Of course, we can't consider them a force sufficient to change the outcome of the conflict. However, if the deployment of soldiers became constant, it could eventually have a significant impact. But the real issue isn't about how many soldiers or how many will arrive, but rather where these soldiers will be deployed. In fact, we don't know if Moscow would want to use them in offensive operations, in controlling the occupied territories, or in protecting infrastructure in Russia. Some of the units might be used in assaults, following the model observed in Kursk. And in this case, it would be advantageous for Russia because they would have infantry to deploy in the riskiest operations. They may spare some of their own soldiers and possibly avoid or limit new politically difficult mobilizations. North Koreans could still be helpful without joining assault units. For example, they could be useful if they were used to guard the occupied territories, defend depots, and protect infrastructure. In this way, they would replace the Russian units that Moscow could transfer to the more important areas of the front. But the real question is whether the North Koreans will enter Ukrainian territories or not. Because it's true that the North Koreans have already fought against the Ukrainians, but so far they've only done it on Russian territory, so they haven't invaded Ukrainian territories. Therefore, North Korean units entering Ukrainian territory would be entirely different. If those units were to cross the border together with Russian forces and were used in offensive operations or in maintaining the occupation, for Pyongyang it would mean actually taking part in the invasion of a sovereign state. However, it must be said that this would also create a problem for the very justification used by Moscow and Pyongyang for the troops deployed in Kursk. The treaty only mentions assistance if either country is attacked, so it's hard to use a defensive clause to justify North Korean soldiers in Ukraine. Even though, and we must never forget this, Russia and North Korea consider the occupied territories as territories annexed to Russia. So based on this, we actually can't rule anything out. But why does Kim want to help Putin? The collaboration between Kim Jong-un and Putin actually serves the interests of both regimes. Russia needs ammunition and men to support the war. Meanwhile, North Korea is looking for economic income and technologies that are hard to obtain because of sanctions. But Russia can find a way to provide them. In fact, it seems that Moscow has transferred to Pyongyang. Air defense systems and fuel have been supplied. In addition, North Korea is believed to be receiving Russian economic assistance. Meanwhile, South Korea and the United States worry that advanced technologies might be transferred for use in North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. According to the documents I've reviewed, Moscow might also help develop North Korea's military satellites, nuclear submarines, and intercontinental missiles, thus creating possible new threats for the United States and its allies in the Indo-Pacific. However, perhaps the most immediate advantage for Pyongyang is military experience. For decades, the North Korean army has prepared for a war it has never actually fought. In Ukraine, North Korean soldiers have instead encountered a real battlefield with massive use of drones, artillery, and electronic warfare. This also applies to missiles, as mentioned before. Using them helps identify ways to improve, which appears to have happened. And all of this weighs on an army that is constantly preparing for a conflict with its neighbor, that is South Korea. Anyway, at the moment, apart from the fact that it seems that North Korea and Russia have built a bridge to connect the two countries, we still don't know exactly what will happen. We have the Ukrainian statements. We do know North Korean troops are in Russia, but we don't have any reliable information about the new soldiers, and above all, no information about where they will be deployed. And do you really think North Korea will take part in the invasion of Ukraine? Let me know in the comments, leave a like, get hyped, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the video. Bye.